So now we have our third class of the school with Professor Gary Dymski from the University of Leeds. Unfortunately, Gary could not come to Campinas this year. No, Gary. Gary
That's
was
it.
very active in the school last year. So it's a pity he couldn't come, but I would like to thank you, Gary, to find the time to give this class and join us at the school this year. So you have around 1 hour, more or less, to give your class, and then we open for questions and discussions. Okay, Gary?
Perfect. Yeah, let me say I've been at the University of Leeds since 2012, and before that, 22 years at the University of California and other places. And I can't be with you because I'm in the middle of leading a giant project on environmental sustainability and inclusive growth and anti-poverty in my region. It's called Yorkshire and the Humber. That's the home region of Leeds. And basically, we've got 12 universities and we're working with 15 units of government. And so it's a giant construction project and it's due on September 19th. So there's much to do. And I really just couldn't come to Campinas much as I love to be at the university. And I've been there. The first time I think was 1998, and since then I've had a love affair with Unicampi. So sorry for that. Let's get into the talk. So I've worked on many topics over the years, and and now as ever there's a lot of engagement with global as well as national and regional local policies. So here I've drafted something that speaks to the topic of the workshop for this year. And so I'm going to I've tailored the talk to that purpose. And let's see if we can get it done. This one and see if it's sharing properly. And looks like it is. And then we're going to go like this. And let me start my clock. Okay, we're good. So I'm going to take you on a journey. And this is a journey in which we're going to look at the situation of the developing economies, the developing countries. And I'm going to argue that there's kind of caught at the minute between financialized capitalism on the one hand and China's economic rise on the other. And this is really about the kind of the continuation of core-periphery dynamics on a globe that we now see is, in fact, burning. So we're going to do this in two parts. And I've got some readings at the end that that can take you a little bit further if you're interested. It includes some work by my colleagues here, Bianca Orsi and Nina Kaltenbrunner. And by the way, I would certainly urge you if you're interested in pursuing either master's or doctoral work, please do look at the University of Leeds, where we've got a nice group here, and we're trying to push forward all of these connections. Okay, so this first part is the global financialized capitalism part, and let's get into it. Let's take you on this journey. Now, let's begin by kind of locking down and understanding where things have come from. And if you know my work, you know that I always keep one foot in thinking about institutional historical developments, and this is no different today. So we go back, and actually I want to take you back to the beginning of what's called the neoliberal era. And that's this era in which basically we see the situation of macroeconomic chaos, and we're not going to spend a lot of time on all the determinants of that because that would take us too long. But just to say that what really happened in the 1980s was due to what was called then stagflation in the 1970s, and then the very aggressive monetary policy by Paul Volcker, the head of the Federal Reserve, and the kind of first manifestations of globalized financial crisis, we saw some dramatic shifts in the 1980s. The first thing is that, and this was accompanied, by the way, by a shift in the kind of posture of the United States and to some extent the European nations. moving away from what had been a kind of Keynesian welfare state capitalism, although we can't exaggerate how deeply rooted that was, toward more of a market-based system. We call this the coming of the neoliberal era. And basically, that included an attack on labor in the United States, the end of the protection of wages, the end of the labor management accord, as it was called, and actually the offshoring of a lot of US manufacturing. That then in turn led to the fact that the United States began to have a systematic current and capital account difference compared to what had been before. You'll see that in the next slide, how dramatic that change was. The second thing was that the macro uncertainty and the macro chaos and the aggressive Volcker interest rate policies destroyed many of the tightly regulated banking systems that had emerged both from the Great Depression and from World War II, and then kind of continued on through the so-called golden age period of capitalism. So we saw this, step-by-step shift from a tightly regulated to a deregulated banking system in the U.S., for example, and that led in part to a crisis in that we're going to skip over the Latin American debt crisis in the 1980s that basically led to the money center banks in the US being guaranteed that they're too big to fail. Meanwhile, European nations were moving toward their own big bang financial market reforms. Japan, too, actually had its big bang. Its banks went through dramatic changes and survived a meltdown that happened at the end of the 1980s. Now, consequences of these dramatic shifts were the following. First of all, here's your United States current account balance and net lending and borrowing from 1980 until 2021. I got to tell you, I've been really working overtime on my project, so I did not have time to update to the latest data for this last year, the slides you're going to see. So my apologies for that. What you see here is basically the United States as of the 1980s goes into systematic deficit, save for 1 year, maybe two, from 1980 until the present. So the current account, the balance on trade is negative for the United States, dramatically negative. That's a lot of money we're talking about right there. That's basically almost $1 trillion deficit there that you're pointing toward. Now, of course, that's offset according to the sheer, logic and algebra of cross-border balances and imbalances. If you have a deficit on current account, you've either got to finance that with reserves you have available, or you've got to borrow from foreigners. You've got to get net lending or borrowing from the rest of the world. That, of course, is exactly what you see here. It's almost like a Rorschach test here. The more negative is the current account, the more positive is the inflow of money from the rest of the world. Now, the language I use is that this makes the United States a global liquidity sink. Now, if you think about what then happened in the 1980s and going forward, you saw, the beginning of the securitized bond market, securitized housing, the mortgage-backed securities market becomes the biggest one in the world by the end of the 1980s, after the U.S. Housing finance system had, on an individual bank basis, had collapsed. And so you see basically that this inflow of money from around the world is the raw fuel that gives Wall Street the raw fuel to build its securities and its shadow banking relationships, and basically to sell them back to the rest of the world when needed. Now, this era, as mentioned, also led to the emergence of a set of too big to fail mega banks, the ones that were protected during the Latin American debt crisis. And notice that these banks have grown tremendously. Here's a picture that shows the growth of what this figure does is it takes the largest bank in each country and basically just tracks out its assets over time, its asset size. You see that Great Britain briefly took the lead before the global financial crisis. That's RBS, which collapsed, of course, then followed by HSBC and whatnot. And you'll see that the United States is actually in there. You can kind of see the competition for global preeminence by banks from these different countries. The United States is just one of the players. And as noted, the shadow banking empire built in the United States based on the subprime lending, the securitization, and then the dispersal through the shadow banking system was the fuel that spread those subprime securities around the world. Now, the thing is, this shows you the United States is in kind of right in the pack there, but check this out. If we look at that same picture, only we take the assets of the largest banks as a percentage of the home nation GDP rather than just sheer dollars, what you see is that actually the United States banks are a very low percentage of the value of the US GDP. Actually, so are the Chinese banks, which are shown there just at the very end in green. For the other banks, quite a difference, right? They're much larger. They put much more of their country at risk. So that's the point, is that the two big failed banks of the United States are protected by the international lender of last resort, the Federal Reserve, that emerged during the Latin American debt crisis as able to take care of other things, to work out the Brady bonds and all of that. And at the same time, the other countries are exposed. And not only that, if you look at some of the countries there, specifically Germany, France, and Spain, are all inside the euro market area. The European Monetary Union, that is to say, inside the Eurozone. They're all beholden to the European Central Bank. They don't even have their own central banks to protect their own banks. Now, the shadow banking system then that started with this, inflow and the explosion of the traditionally regulated banks and all of that, this system grows and grows and grows. Now you can see that it reaches a peak in the period of the Great Crisis and just after, but basically it persists. And you see as well what's now become a competition between, on the one hand, I've updated that chart, which only goes through 2017, showing the size of non-bank credit intermediation, i.e., the shadow banks. That's the colorful ones there. And this is just for US intermediation. And then I've shown against that the net loans by all US commercial banks. And you can see how basically they've now crawled ahead of the others. That's largely due to the success of the six protected mega banks that dominate the US banking system. Then you can also see there the publicly traded investment funds. So there's now this kind of shift from market-based credit to bank-based credit, or rather to market-based credit from bank-based credit as the main concern of central bankers. And in this new world of finance, let me go the other way. Sorry for that. In shifting to Europe, we see that actually shadow banking in Europe has also remained very important and key to the whole system there. The MFIs there, that's the non-bank intermediation. So that's just about half of the European lending is now through non-banks. And actually, this broad measure of shadow banking shows you on the right-hand side that investment funds and other financial institutions, have basically, continued to grow in Europe, which, keep in mind, was behind the United States in its adoption of some of these instruments, but has embraced them fully, as you can see, with barely a stop through the European crisis that followed this subprime crisis per se, partly because the banks there were deeply compromised by what Yanis Varoufakis reminds us in looking at the European banking crisis and the Greek crisis of the post GFC period. He reminds us that that's a banking crisis disguised as a sovereign debt crisis, and actually the crisis of banks continued, and that's why you see the shift of lending into non-bank channels as reported there. Now, there's been different kinds of reforms since then. There was different legislations passed in different places, notably the act in the United States that was supposed to protect the big banks from themselves so that they would only play safe. But the fact of the matter is that the mega bank system protected and too big to fail, knowing that they will be covered by a Federal Reserve that remains a global power, globally able to protect the asset values of financial institutions, at least until present time. That knowing they're protected, they continue to operate a super leveraged financial system. And what this chart here shows is that basically what's happened because of that is that the Federal Reserve, in this case, the New York Fed, has continually been pulled into having to throw reserves, reverse repos, into the money markets, which are now hyper leveraged. Basically there's something called rehypothecation, where you're able to use as money market borrowings something that's just a promise to hold a money market borrowing when the actual instrument, like say a bond or a security, may be passed around as many as 16 times between different institutions. Consequently, what you see here is the continual involvement from time to time of the Fed. Their job is now to be at the base of the market-based lending system. Now, Perry Marilling has called this the emergence of the situation in which the Fed is not the lender of last resort, but the Fed is the market maker of last resort. And now the reason that these red spikes are here is that those are moments where the supply of available reserves or reverse repos in the money markets wasn't there. Somebody pulled out and stopped dancing. And because of that, they had to jump into the system. So it's a system that remains desperately over leveraged. And actually, this is one way for us to understand what quantitative easing is or was. It was initially used to save the mega banks. And you see how basically what we have there is the size of the Federal Reserve is shown there on the right-hand side of the graph. And basically, it's cranking along, and then it gets bigger. And the first thing it gets bigger for is a liquidity injection to keep the banks from collapsing. But then they buy more and more government bonds and corporate bonds. What that is basically the Federal Reserve and other central banks taking securities off of the markets and injecting the needed liquidity. That's become a very strange literature on the so-called shortage of safe assets, which we can talk about if you'd like at some point. And so, you have this system in which it's no longer about the central bank staying passively on the sidelines and waiting until there's a cyclical downturn, and then they tighten or whether it's too much inflation, and then they jump in and they tighten credit, and then there's a downturn, and then they say, okay, with Minsky, we're going to jump in and we're going to save the system, and we go back and forth in the cyclical fluctuation. What we've seen is the emergence of central banking, in which basically the number one concern of the central bank is to maintain the stability of the globalized financial system. Its inflation fighting activities are secondary to that because this job never stops. And so we talked about rehypothecation and the fact that the banks now count on the central banks to backstop their position taking, to provide reserves on demand whenever they need it. This is by these reverse repos and so on. And I just mentioned that Daniela Gabor has done the leading work on this, and of course she's particularly featured what we see on this page, the repo market, the heart of the money market now, and it runs on this. There's our word, rehypothecation. It's the sequential reselling of the same securities. So I have a security, I lend it to you, and you give me a promise to repay. You take that security and you lend it on in exchange for a promise to repay. That person to whom you've given it lends it on, lends it on, lends it on. That's our 16 times. So you have one actual asset that's actually supporting as many as 16 positions that are made out of air. It's Air Jordan. There's nothing there. They've jumped off the ground and they're hanging in midair, waiting for when things go wrong, when people don't play the game, the Federal Reserve to save them. What we've got highlighted there is one period of time. There was, I think it was, I forget it, which specific date, 2018. I thought it was November, but maybe I'm a bit wrong, where the rate jumps and then it jumps again I think that is maybe October of 2019, because basically suddenly people weren't able to keep everything under control, and the fragility of the system was dramatically exposed momentarily before the Fed comes in and makes everything right. Now, the thing about this is that the same banks that were responsible for getting everything fouled up in the subprime lending debacle actually are involved in the kind of games that you can play when you're able to super leverage your borrowings, and therefore you can engage in lots and lots of lending, or lots of third party lending, or underwriting, or securitization, and basically keep your fees and your interest income coming in. And so what we have here is especially fees. You make the loan, you bundle it, you sell it, you get your fees. You get more reserves, you get paid for that. You bundle, you sell again, again, again. And who's involved? Look at these banks. Most of these are the same players who were responsible for the hyper leveraging of the mortgage lending market prior to the great crash of 2007, 2008. Same players, continuing as if they're immortal. Now you notice that the Credit Suisse is there, and oh well, there's a sad story somewhere in there about Swiss banking, but basically, it's a club for big kids. So you now have this kind of game of chicken in global finance between mega banks who want to have high de-risk returns, regulators behind them, always a step behind the bank innovations, who are dragged along. So the mega banks can always find somewhere new to go, a new market to open up. This happens to be the leveraged loan market. There's now even a newer one after that. The leveraged loan market is basically non-market grade loans that are made without much disclosure and sometimes without collateral, just exchange among friends. High rates, good rates of return. You want to beat the market rate of return because you've been, until the recent episode, in a very low interest rate environment. How are you going to get out of that? Well, by basically taking a risk somewhere. Can you do that? Yeah, you can, because banks are willing to make those loans and sell them to people who think that they're going to live forever. Now, just to finish on this first part, what we have here is this situation in which my friends over at UNCTAD call debt-led growth as a defining feature of the global macroeconomy. So we have this pattern of cross-border flows in which basically there's a combination of stagnant macro growth and declining provision capacity for the governments that are in principle responsible for taking care of the populations that live in their countries. So the structure of this is what? You have this chronic deficit on current account of the United States. That's the structural anchor of the neoliberal world, right? That's been the continuing feature. And it's also why the Wall Street banks can outcompete the European banks in the global competition to see who's going to be in charge of the Western financial global system. And this is offset, more than offset, by the export surpluses of China and some European nations. So what you have in this situation is that the developing countries have been elbowed into deficits. It's a structural fix. The net investment position of the United States steadily declines, while those of developing countries stay in deficit or worsen. And as a consequence, the fiscal capacity of developing nations to fund anything like the SDGs to counter climate change is severely damaged. Many governments cannot even provide for their citizens' basic welfare. I'll show you, there's several pictures that characterize what's going on. I'll give you just these two. Basically, have a look here. And basically, let's first start with the advanced economies minus the US, Japan, Korea, and Taiwan. That's the black line. Notice that what you see is that those economies, the advanced economies, are going from a situation of deficit in the year that launched the great financial crisis, 2008, to surplus today. Those economies, the global north, save for the United States and those three countries, are in surplus. Now, how about Japan, Korea, Taiwan? Well, again, now that's the dotted line with the little diamonds. Notice that they've been consistently in surplus all the way through. Those are trading, export-oriented nations. Let's go down then to the gray dotted line, and that of China. And what we see is that China too has consistently been in surplus during these years. So who's in deficit? Well, actually, two things. One, the United States, you see the very consistent uh, solid gray line at the bottom of the page. There's your United States current account deficit continuing through all that time. But then the dramatic change here is for the other countries, the emerging and developing economies as a whole, minus China. And what you see is that they've gone from being in surplus actually until in net. And of course, there's many different types of countries and exporters and importers contained inside that big category of emerging market and developing economies. That said, it's basically everybody else except for China in that picture. But basically, they've then gone into deficit and remain in deficit. This is why I call it a structural fix. That the developing countries, minus China, must borrow. They have no choice. Because why? Because there is a structural deficit on current account. Now, of course, the United States has one too, but the United States has a globally traded deficit. It's got the what's it called by Eichengreen, the exorbitant privilege of the U.S. dollar, but nobody else has got that, and instead the other countries are in surplus. Why? Well, they adopted basically macro constrained policies after the Great Depression. So what you see here as well, and we'll go just a little bit through this one here. It just shows you what you would imagine, which is that what about the net investment position? And what you see is that basically the emerging developing economies and the United States are in increasing deficit or steady deficit in the case of the emerging and developing economies. And meanwhile, the other countries basically plow ahead. And so you're getting deeper into debt, and it's going systematically by global block. So, what you have is this is based on this global architecture of power in finance. Now, we have to understand that, we could take a post-Keynesian institutionalist macro framework and then add to it and allow for asymmetric power across national borders and even inside nation states. We're not going to have time to talk about the consequences of unequal power inside nation states, because that leads to many, many perverse things. But we're just going to say that looked at the global level, you have the US and the US investments as a safe haven because the rest of the world plunged repeatedly into crisis. Of course, ultimately the US itself. But now again, the US is some kind of a haven, it seems. Meanwhile, it's the Federal Reserve's international lender of last resort role that gives the US its positional power. It defines the rules of the game. Global deregulation means that it's protected. Too big to fail mega banks are pushing ahead with more and more innovations, always backstopped by the Fed. Nobody else can keep up. So this positionality, of course, allows the United States to be the global consumer of last resort, living beyond its means for 40 years or more. Of course, it's historically contingent, but it also requires that the U.S. continue the set of rules as they've had. Now, the thing is that even this set of rule is rules, speculation seeking global financial architecture still has rules. And rule number one is cash flows across the borders of financial hub nations have no citizenship. require no passport, and cannot be blocked. So there's many examples of this, and that's the system works as long as nobody messes with it. Recent trends, like the freezing of Russian assets and reserves, have actually put this into question. But the consequence of this whole system is that we have this global pyramid, as Jane Jurista has called it, wherein only the country at the top can stop crises. Global holdings of U.S. liabilities support financial globalization globally and increase the return to predation and speculation. So, where the money goes depends on where the opportunities are. Now, what are those in a world of global stagnation? Well, those are bubbles, basically. It's a bubble driven growth world. And so, this secular stagnation of the advanced nations has turned the developing countries from surplus to deficit. And here's just another picture just to show you a different way the surplus to deficit situation. Let's move on though and just get into the fact that some consequences and implications of this whole situation, and then we'll turn to China. So first, and then we'll get from there to sustainable finance. So we have these kind of double hubs of global power. We have, on the one hand, if you just take a big step back, whilst the United States was becoming this financial hub, in a sense, weirdly fueled by its current account deficit, on the other side of the world, you have the rise of the manufacturing core. Exactly, and as mentioned, the hollowing out of union jobs and manufacturing in much of Europe, most of the United Kingdom, and most of the United States, with that role taken over by East Asian nations, especially China. So you have a financial core on one side and a manufacturing core on the other side. And these are, interdependent cores. The United States is dependent on East Asia's exports, and East Asia relies on U.S. consumer and investment markets. We'll see that actually very dramatically when we start part two in a couple of minutes. But what there is in between these two cores is this kind of extensive peripheral margin where nation states have risks along both dimensions. They have financial fragilities and provisioning fragilities. Some of the people subject to those fragilities were forced to get on a barge offshore of the UK this morning in one of the coastal cities, Portsmouth. But basically, this all fits into this pattern of global unequal power. So, implications. First, the Latin American financial trap. Nations that are at or near the core of both poles are immune from speculative attack. But actually, nations in the middle are exposed. Global financial firms will use speculative financial attacks to take gains where they can, especially when these nations have thinner exchange rate and asset markets. So basically, the nations that are subject to this kind of power have to use defensive power, the power to be left alone, or they can use capital controls. They can basically have some requirements on foreign direct investment, or they can build up stocks of foreign currency reserves. They got to do something to protect themselves, even as their current account balances deteriorate. Latin America is especially trapped in a peripheral position along both the financial and industrial dimensions. Its nations remain dependent on exporting commodities. The result is to create extremes of wealth and poverty, leads to ever increasing financialization, increasing political frustration, and volatility for the voting public. Here's an overall picture of what's happened with current account erosion and reserve assets in Latin America. Reserve assets, which are shown on the, I think it is left-hand side, continually go up. And meanwhile, the current account, which is shown on the right-hand side, continually goes down. So that is a pattern that's consistent with what we saw elsewhere. And in terms of net investment position, what we see is that assets rise, and those are especially foreign currency reserves, whilst it is basically borrowing to maintain that position. Nicole Cerpa and I laid this out in an article that appeared recently in the CJE. So, second implication, weirdly, you would think that this would all be good for the United States and the global north, but actually you have, remember, this is all fueled by incredible amounts of inequality. So you have in the developing countries, of course, you have crises and instability of provisioning and so on, and lots of flows of economic migrants to advanced countries. But in those countries, in the advanced countries, you have increasingly embittered citizens who are taking these actions like, well, we don't want to give human service to everybody. Let's keep people out. Let's basically, that we want to have low wage disposable labor, but we don't want them to live amongst us. So we see the rise of this anti-foreigner nationalist political movements across the global north. Lots of paranoid ideas bringing a lot of ghosts out of the closet. White supremacy, national socialism, making a comeback, etc. So those in subaltern positions in the stratification structure in the global north have to relive histories of racial and ethnic violence, exploitation, and oppression. This this whole dynamic blocks any response to climate change or enhanced human provisioning. The situation is beyond an emergency. Now, before we get to the next step about that emergency, let's talk about China. So, part two, take a deep breath. We're 34 minutes in, and I don't think we've got 34 minutes ahead of us. So, let's just jump. Deep breath, China. Okay, very quick whistle stop tour. China's leaders have consistently said that China is not going to follow the US path of issuing the world's dominant currency, backstopping the global financial system, and indeed, it will not become the hegemonic power, to use the Kindleberger phrase, for the global system. They're not going to do that. Instead, they followed a developing country formula for growth. Initially, the 1970s and 80s, their liberalization phase as they came out of the Cultural Revolution was there were three elements from there until the Great Crisis. First, what's their formula? First, let's export manufacturing goods by setting up export zones that are going to give foreign-owned manufacturers access to cheap Chinese labor in exchange for technology transfer. Now, that technology transfer eventually leads to the buildup and construction of Chinese competitors, ultimately Chinese multinationals. But that's the first trade, the first element. Secondly, let's meanwhile, while we're doing that, let's build up an increasingly integrated East Asian consumption complex. So you're acquiring goods through trade and so on. And third element, I guess there's four elements. Sorry for that. The third element is tight controls over the financial sector. You got the big five banks and the People's Bank of China, some baby steps toward private finance, but those big five banks are engines of industrial growth controlled very closely by the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party. Then the final element was, meanwhile, you have the dominant role of state owned enterprises. Now, whilst an increasing amount of GDP is generated by private enterprises, especially in that period, before the great financial crisis, state owned enterprises were dominant. And especially there were, you had this sort of replacement where back in the old days, you would have the township village enterprises that would employ everybody, kind of on, small towns and rural areas. And instead, as you're doing your population shift from rural to urban, you set up more properly state-owned enterprises that take over from what they call the TVEs. Now, China's structural dependence is shown here by Brad Setzer of the Peterson Institute for International Economics. One picture is worth 1,000 words. Manufactured goods surplus, commodity deficit for China, full stop, period. They have got to export because they've got to import commodities if they want to continue to grow. And that growth, this trade is increasingly inside Asia. This just, this big red dot here just shows you that most 44% of global trade flows are inside Asia. And just notice that it dwarfs all the other numbers. Intra-South American trade, 1% of the global total. This is Harvard Business Review. I think it's from about 2014. Okay. Now we're going to pause for a minute, and we're going to come back to the global crisis. But just note that that through 2015, it was kind of a plan for China to gradually internationalize its currency. The renminbi, or the yuan, would be internationalized in exchange for China taking a role in co-leading shared monetary arrangements globally. And there was the most famous speech was by Zhao Zhaoxuan in 2009. He made a speech in which he basically said, let's follow Keynes's Bancor. Let's no more have a dollar-centered system. Let's use the system of special drawing rights to create the true vision of a global internet, global central bank that can handle the overall system. Let's move from a US-centered system to a shared system. And just a word there in case you've not come across special drawing rights very much. And the idea here was that Zhao said, look, we're going to internationalize the renminbi, but we want to do it in the context of a shared system, not a US dominated system. Now, there was liberalization of foreign asset holdings for Chinese at this point in time. However, note that there's this drop in basically from 2014 to 2015, almost $1 trillion leaves China. That leads to renewed restrictions, and that brings us to the next phase of the drama here, because what was this Chinese model that private enterprise growing, public enterprise remaining prominent. One of the papers selected for you to take a look at, if you'd like, is by the Brazilian economist Jabor and Dantas. Brilliant paper talking about how, well, you look at China and it has a capitalist form. It still remains a planned and centrally controlled economy, kind of contradiction in that sense. These authors argued that China's been inventing higher forms of economic planning that even can take a capitalist form. But now, what's happening? During the time that they're writing this paper, Xi Jinping is taking control in China, and he's trying to rein in corruption, get rid of excess profit making by the party insiders, and he's looking to the parallel between Japan and China. Both nations have to trade manufactured goods for export, for commodity imports. Both have grown to a global scale, and so that they become big enough that the domestic and global economic dynamics are intertwined. However, he looks at Japan and he sees that Japan has stalled and aged. And actually, what it dates back to when it threatened U.S. global leadership, the leadership backed off. Its manufacturers had been setting up U.S. production sites, and for example, Honda factories and Toyota factories in the U.S. But basically, in an event that's forgotten in the rest of the world, but very well remembered in Asia, you have the 1985 Plaza Accord, where basically the big five nations, the big four nations, get together. At that point, it was the U.S., Germany, France, and Britain, and they basically sit down with Japan and say, "Look, quit investing so rapidly elsewhere in the world." They asked Japanese to turn their investment financing inward rather than continuing to build what was then the largest set of financial institutions in the world. Well, Japan did turn inward, and what happens was a bubble, stock market and housing bubble, that leads to stagnation, and what in Japanese feeling is perceived as a depression or recession that in some sense has not really ceased so much since then. China doesn't want to follow that path. So as they see that Xi Jinping is looking back at this, so as he's taking control after the great financial crisis, he's got some challenges. Chinese labor is no longer the cheapest in the world. And in fact, you no longer are doing much as much technology transfer as you were in a lot of industries. You've got good advanced industries. There's still areas where you're learning, but many fewer. And increasingly, Japan has the problem, or excuse me, China has the problem that Japan had in the 1970s. Its labor is no longer the cheapest. Now, Japan had solved that problem with its flying geese paradigm. That's where Japan would keep its headquarters centralized in Japan and then offload its fabrications, its factories to the rest of East Asia so that the lead goose leads, that's Japan, and the other geese follow. But now, basically, the collapse of Western finance and the sort of retreat of leading nations' central banks into supporting their excessively leveraged global financial system suggested that, basically, the West is becoming weak. Maybe global separation would be the better answer. So rather than Japan stepping back so the Western growth could continue to grow could continue as it arguably had, if on a very fragile basis, again, in a period in which, keep in mind the 1980s and 90s, in which the global financial complex was growing, China looks at that and says, no. Basically, we have a surplus on current account. And basically, our challenge is, do we buy foreign portfolio and capital assets, or do we build up excess reserves? If we do the former, if we invest in the Western leading nations, you're going to provoke nationalist backlashes as happened before. If you have your excess reserves, you can only feed global demand with those if you channel those back into the system. Now, China also has the challenge of maintaining domestic economic stability, avoiding bubble-led growth. And they need what, again, Varoufakis has a nice phrase. They require a surplus transfer mechanism, something that takes net spending power from areas inside your country that have surpluses into areas that have deficits. Something like, inside Europe, from Germany to Greece, that kind of thing. And basically, you got to avoid bubble, and you've got this problem of what to do with your surplus. Well, and here's just an example, just one that just shows you that there's many pictures that suggest that there's a possible emergence of financial or housing bubbles in China. Here's just one very dramatic picture that argues that China is on course to have a worse bubble than Japan did. That's the bubble that Japan got when it turned itself inward. So there's things to control in China. Okay, now, what China does as an answer is it launches this is under Xi Jinping, 2015, it launches the Belt and Road Initiative. And this BRI is a separate path. The idea is to build infrastructure bridges to market hubs and sources of scarce minerals and commodities, especially primarily along the Euro-Asian landmass. This generates, for one thing, huge contracts for Chinese firms. It takes your surplus Chinese labor and puts it to work in Africa and the Middle East and so on, and for that matter, Eastern Europe and even Western Europe. The rebuilding, for example, of the Greek port of Piraeus. And so this gives you massive commitments in Africa, Central Asia, Eastern Europe, even the EU. But this basically brings us to a problem that China has not solved and maybe cannot solve given its choice of strategy. China's success is based on basically the continuing CCP control. At the same time, the more it expands into other developing countries, into the broader world, the less it's able to control. There's feedback effects from expanding into areas it doesn't control and that use different monies to compared to where it does. Now, here's just a picture of the Belt and Road Initiative. And I give you this, it's the Bertelsmann Foundation, a German foundation, just because it shows you kind of the way that the rest of the world maybe sees. This is the Chinese dragon blowing fire on Europe in a certain way. And basically, you see how the little anchors there, Chinese are buying the ports of these different cities. Even Rotterdam, proud Rotterdam, 35% Chinese owned. So that's the idea, is that China is building its infrastructure. What to do about that? Now, especially the problem, though, is the special problem was, how do you fund and finance, to use a Kajim de Carvalho's distinction, infrastructure development in other parts of Asia, East Europe, and Africa? If you use the renminbi, and if you fund via the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank or the China Development Bank, you're going to basically uh, put possibly unpayable assets on your own institution's balance sheets. But if you rely on borrower country currency, then currency that's low in the currency hierarchy, then you're going to introduce the possibility of unpayability and over indebtedness there anyways. Lots of the countries that are partners in the Belt and Road Initiative have been under IMF supervision, and basically they're you've got to then coordinate with Western creditors as even while you're trying to separate your economy from the West. So there's further vulnerabilities as well that have recently been exposed. One is the famous U.S.-China trade war, and basically you see these geopolitical tensions, China's rising nationalism, the Russian war with Ukraine, highlights, as does the coronavirus epidemic, highlights the tensions along the geopolitical scale, which turn into geoeconomic problems. Of course, Donald Trump, once and maybe future U.S. president, played to his domestic base that was hurt by the end of unionization, and basically, declares a trade war with China, 2018. Now, Trump's no longer president, but Trumpism is very real. The notion that somebody else has to pay somebody else took what I was owed, and they got to pay. Um, this is something that's very real and very felt in lots of corners in the U.S. So, how about the Biden government? Basically, not much different, to be honest, than Trump. There's been some reductions in tariffs, but the industrial and geopolitical conflicts remain volatile. Here's just a quick picture. There's the middle blue period there. This is from the Peterson Institute for International Economics. It shows you the trade war period, and after the trade war, that later period on the right hand side, that's when Biden takes over, and you can see that the tariffs on average are not much different. And in fact, Rana Foroohar, Financial Times columnist, well worth reading, has then talked about how, in various writings, that the coronavirus has increased this problem of decoupling of the global economies. And you kind of see this because basically, here's a picture of trade between 2015 and 2019. And what we have here is basically just a picture of changes in trade. And green arrows are where it's been getting bigger in those years, and the orange arrows where it's been getting smaller. Notice that you see the effect there of the growing hostility between China and the US. Everything else is growing. But then when we look at the more recent period, what we see here is basically even more slowdown between US and China, and slow down with the EU and other parts of the world as well. So we're moving from a more and more trading world post crisis to a world that's increasingly suspicious of trading. And so this is something where, the geopolitical uh, conflicts have led to geoeconomic challenges as yet untaken. Now, we've got about 9 minutes left. So take another deep breath, and we're just going to take a quick look at some of the possibilities for what do we do about climate change. Now, I got to say, I developed a series of talks and thinking before before the pandemic that were widely discussed in the United Nations at UNCTAD. Actually, I mean, not mine per se, but it was the topic, what to do about global warming and sustainable development goals. And actually, since the pandemic, the conversations have been mostly about how do you keep the developing countries from sinking under the obligations of coronavirus, now the war, now the commodities prices, all these things that have been happening. But basically, the picture here is that the countries that are going to need the most help in terms of meeting both sustainable development goals, leaving aside the cynicism that we want to bring to that topic, um, are countries that basically tend to have less fiscal capacity. So if you're serious about a global Green New Deal, GND, then basically, and if you want to, okay, let's put people to work and let's have a good global economy that's also greening itself, then you need a credible effort to basically transfer finance from countries that have a lot to those who have too little. Now, there was discussion at the Glasgow Climate Conference in 2021 where they made these targets and all this. I mean, they've done that. This has been done continually. But the question posed is, can you do it with your existing global system? Now, what was celebrated at Glasgow and critiqued actually by us in the UN before that, for what it was worth, was that there was a celebration of something called blended finance. Now, blended finance is what? And this was reinvigorated due to the COVID. Okay, basically, what it is that you say that the public institutions, and they're thinking of the global financial institutions in particular, will be willing to take the risk to provide the finance, and because the public funds are taking the risks associated with cross-border finance to fund sustainable development goals, to fund climate change mitigation or adaptation, then basically the private capital should come in willingly because it's risk-free money, risk-free investment options, financing options. Now, the key to that is to use securitization. And, as you, not surprising, right? And the UNCTAD itself opens the door. It's not bothered with the quote. The idea is just says what I just said, that, you're gonna basically de-risk this money and the private sector should come on in. Well, actually, what ends up happening is that they launch that thing. Now, these numbers are a little bit old, but blended finance has only raised about, $81 billion. Now, how much money is needed? Well, I'll tell you what, we did calculations. They're kind of crazy calculations. These were done at UNCTAD using their macro model. You got about a $93 trillion global economy, and they figured about $3 trillion a year would be needed to take care of financing the SDGs and climate change. There's a lot of money, much more than $81 billion. So how are you going to get this thing bigger in scale? Well, there's a system that was worked out, and the idea was, well, you'd put the IMF in charge of this tiered system where they would be in control and surveil everything. And that's been an ongoing conversation at the United Nations elsewhere. What's the future of the IMF? Are they the world's policeman or are they the world's planning bureau? Well, they're not sure. And meanwhile, they if you read their blogs, they play it both ways. And then you would take but they would be in charge. Then you have the international financial institutions and multilateral development banks that would join up and they would shift from making loans to making loan guarantees and underwriting. Then supposedly the private sector would rush in and make all the loans, and those could be securitized, backstopped by the MDBs and IFIs, and everybody would live happily forever after. Well, the thing is, to do this, you would need to reorient your international financial institutions. You'd have to deliver more bankable projects. And what the investigations by people who I was talking to for a little, several times at UNCTAD about that is that, they try to get the big banks interested in bankable projects. The big banks, no, they're used to doing stuff fast. They don't want to pay attention to details. They don't want it tailored one by one by one. They want to make money fast. And basically, they weren't interested in step number two. Then you'd have to use syndication securitization. Now, of course, the big banks would do that. They don't want to make the loans, but they would happily securitize whatever somebody else is going to give them. Then you have all these foreign exchange risks to consider, and then there'd be political risks. And then basically, you have to deepen your markets to have local currency financing. There's a lot of things to happen, and none of those were really working. Furthermore, and we're just about toward the end of our discussion here, take a step back and keep in mind that the securitization that would be proposed actually looks an awful lot like the Brady bond securitization that took the defaulted Latin American bank loans off the balance sheets of the big banks that were in trouble back in the 80s, and the backstop by government again. And essentially, Brady bonds became this kind of emerging bond market that grew and grew and grew, backstopped, and eventually became a kind of form of financial market surveillance over developing economy policies. It didn't actually prevent or block or cure those crises. It just managed them in the interest of global finance. So while blended finance was highlighted as the global fix for SDGs and climate action, actually the expectations were not met. And I just note here that they didn't get it done, and expectations that it could bridge the gap are unrealistic. Billions to billions is more plausible than billions to trillions, which is what you need if you're going at the global scale. Now, a few more things then to say. With the pandemic, there was some hope that special drawing rights, as mentioned, they have this special status. They're money that you can create without making debt. And, couldn't you create more SDRs, special drawing rights? After all, they were conceived by UNCTAD in the early 1960s and so on. But basically, no. The answer was no. There was no will to do that. That actually, let's skip this because by now your eyes are going to be tired, and your ears going to be tired of my voice too. But basically, what this graph shows is that special drawing right allocations by country were mostly taken by developing countries, not by developed countries, and not widely used. So basically, there's several proposals that are out there about what to do about creating money that can be used to finance things if we don't rely on private markets, as per the blended finance system. Well, one approach is that let's take unused SDR allocations and make them available to developing countries through the IMF. Well, okay, you could make this trust and make it more eligibility for middle income countries. Then you can enhance the capital of regional development banks. But I don't have to tell you that, for example, regional development banks like BNDES are, at the national scale, are subject to political to and fro. And all these proposals come with policy conditionalities. So, it's not really a solution. UNCTAD offered a solution that looked like, something more real. They said, well, let's issue special purpose SDRs that can go specifically to deal with climate change issues and to finance the SDRs. But basically, while this was proposed, it would require changing the Articles of Agreement of the IMF. And that's not going to happen anytime soon. There's too much suspicion in the world to have the world's nations, leading nations, most influential in the United Nations, to link arms and join together in solving this global problem. So, 2 pages of conclusion then. First, you see global financial cycles, and there's a literature on that, and you kind of get interested in looking at global financial cycles. But keep in mind that these global financial cycles are reflecting the structural features of a global macro financial system rooted in power and stratification imbalances. In that system, South America is subordinate. Its currency is unstable. You have a withering manufacturing capacity and dependence on foreign capital and currency. This is a consequence of its history, right? As amplified by asymmetric structures of global financial power, trade and commodity linkages. The great Indian economist and good friend Sunanda Sen have shown that these power imbalances are rooted in histories of imperialism and colonialism. And as was pointed out recently, the loss and damage debate about the climate crisis has actually, regarding the responsibility of global North countries for the superexposure of many global South nations to the worst consequences of climate change, refers to these histories. Now, my friend Marshall and the late and much lamented Eugenia Correa argue in, I think, Eugenia's last article that intersectional divides inside countries provide pre-made categories for dehumanization. It's a savage last resort for humanity that's unable to free itself of neoliberal disorder. As these authors put it, we're now at the crossroads. And they're writing in the context of the coronavirus crisis, a paper that's should be available for you. It brings us closer to the day of reckoning. Pandemic, Ukrainian war spending, add to pre-existing national fiscal stresses. It brings these global tipping points into view, ecological, social, and economic tipping points, all interrelated. But political paralysis and crisis in the global north have hardened global north nations' policies toward immigrants and refugees precisely at the time when global south nations' provisioning capacity is threatened as never before. Meanwhile, the support pillars sustaining this whole system, which is a system that creates and recreates and builds again financial fragility, stagnation, loans, losses, and crises. That is the global mega banking system and the central banks in the key currency countries. These support pillars remain in place, weirdly, even as the political foundations of the global order give way. Raises us the question for us: will the world burn before capitalism is reformed? And I'm going to leave it there. There's some readings that you can look up, and let me stop sharing and let's talk.
I don't know, I think everyone is shy, Gary.
I think everybody's shy. If I was there, it would be different. And I apologize for the distance created by this. We're not able to go to lunch together and to drink a beer or a cachaça, so it's a different situation than would normally be. And plus, the message is heavy. Let's face it. I see us at, as Eugenia put it, we're at the crossroads.
Well, I'm gonna break the ice.
Can
Hi,
you hear
Gary.
Gary?
Hello.
Hi, Gary. Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. And I would like to ask you about Biden economics. Because you heard a lot about it here in Brazil, and there's probably a lot of exaggeration when it comes to the manufacturing industry driven push that this administration is trying to convey. And I'd like to hear from you, what do you think the probable results of the, for instance, attempt of bringing back some productive chains that were based in Asia to the US. We're discussing here in the last session, the attempt of bringing TSMC investment to Arizona, like $400 billion. Do you believe that it might somehow renew US industrial capabilities against China? And maybe having a way of bringing another track for US capitalist model in the future with just a very small fixed on a state that continues to be compromised with global financial interests.
Yeah, thanks for that. Let me, maybe others can find their questions as we get into this a little bit. Yeah, Bidenomics. It's first of all, you know that Biden has wanted to be president for a long time, and he's a person who knows how to make a deal, and he adopts something that on the surface looks like a super progressive strategy. You know, let's really stand behind U.S. industries and so on. Actually, it's more complicated. Uh, First of all, the incentives uh, in the Biden's bills in the IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, strangely enough, is what they call it, actually are weighted toward tax breaks that are and subsidies that mostly go to very large corporations. So that's the first thing. Secondly, the the everyday living wage of people has not changed much. There is more employment creation, but the employment creation is at a fairly low level of actually of of wages. There has not been a restoration of like golden age wages, etc. It's not like that. That has not happened. And instead, what you see is a situation in which basically the economy is growing, um, and employment is growing, but the jobs on offer often remain precarious, and the living of people, remains consumption and so on, also remains precarious. Meanwhile, asset prices have continued to grow again. Housing prices are now back on their upward trajectory, and the Wall Street assets and so on are going up as before. So you have kind of something like the Obama economy or the Clinton economy, in which it was premised on basically open borders, open trade, and will allow the growing financial centralization of wealth in exchange for just enough jobs for everybody and open credit markets where people can borrow. What's different now is that, well, first, there's now this rejection of the idea of open borders and all of that. No, no, we're gonna make some choices. Secondly, the notion that you can borrow freely at will is compromised now. So that's why it looks like there's a lot of employment growth and everything is better, but the ability of people to negotiate the costs that they face is compromised. And indeed, it's taken a pretty savage increase in interest rates by the Federal Reserve to get things under control. And so there's that. Now, will this result in the recentering of manufacturing in the United States? I don't think so. I mean, first of all, this has been a discussion with Jamie Galbraith for years. The number of workers actually employed in manufacturing sector has gone down even in China and in Germany and elsewhere. And those jobs are often linked critically to technologies that are basically in danger because of climate change. And so I'll give you an example from Germany. In Germany, about 5% of the population of the manufacturing directly linked is involved in making basically gas using automobiles, gas or diesel. And about another 12% is in industries linked to that. So about one in one in five euros of European production is directly linked to an obsolete technology that's soon going to be unviable. So there's problems like that in manufacturing in the US. And there's where, when we go to the newer technologies, we're seeing competition between China and the US and the European blocs. That's a very confused competition. Now, that's where actually Rana Farahar, that journalist I cited, she's been studying a lot and reflecting on the problem of possible global separation and uncoupling, as they call it. I don't see how uncoupling is going to work without continued severe conflict, because we see the flashpoints. The flashpoints are, as ever, oil, the Middle East, gas, and so on, and actually the Russia-Ukraine war and agricultural goods, not to mention scarce earth, etc. And of course, Africa is caught up in that, Middle East caught up in that, and Russia and Ukraine caught up in that. And you can't cleanly separate unless you're in a circular economy age, in which basically we've broken free of the carbon burning technologies, and nobody's anywhere near that yet. So I think in some sense the Biden move is an impossible move. The promise, and what it's actually doing is further causing stress on allies that the US needs if it's going to continue its geopolitical conflict with China. So we're at a again, there's another unstable point that we seem to have reached.
Any other questions, comments?
Okay.
You first. You can closer, it's better.
You can sit here?
Yeah.
So, thank you, Gary Dymski, for your wonderful presentation. I would like to know whether you could explain a bit further your vision on the balance of payment situations on the financial cycles to the Latin American countries, because lately we have been dealing with the fact that the external relations, the external crises in Latin America have been very different from the past. Only Argentina and even Venezuela, they have a balance of payment constraints and a really external situation that it's really similar to the past. But nowadays, with the commodity cycles and our surplus in the commercial accounts. In Brazil, for example, we don't have a similar situation of not having dollars or anything like that. But we did have two major exchange rates devaluations in the last decade. So do you think that in spite of the commercial account situation that we have in Latin America, we still have to deal with exchange rate risks of devaluations driven by potential financial instabilities in the world? And what do you think are the main threats to our financial stabilities in this sense? Do you think that it can compensate the good situation that we have in our commercial accounts, and it can compensate this threat in our exchange rate position in Brazil? Oh, that's it.
Yeah, it's a tough
Gary,
one, right?
Can we include another question?
Sure.
In the US.
Can you hear me there from here?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for your amazing presentation. I have a question, one in the sense of a political economy sense, and that was made during our presentation in the financial sense. There was a question wondering if the financial system is enough for the necessities of the climate transition. And I was wondering, mainly after yesterday's presentation on prices in theory from Sean, if the neoliberal rationality and neoliberal logic that has been the compass of policy on central economies is enough to tackle the necessities of integration and the recognition of a common problem that requires a new solution, that is the climate crisis. And a solution that seems, for me at least, that be outside of the reach of the neoliberal rationality for even the state and the companies and even as individuals. If we are able to tackle the problem of will the world burn before capitalism is reformed in a neoliberal architecture of rationality.
Boy. Okay. Two big questions. Let's get into them one by one. Balance of payments. Yeah, let's the figures that I showed and that you'll see in the CJE article, if you have a look at that, show that the problem of overall balance of payments problem is common to virtually all Latin American countries. At the same time, as you mentioned, the degree of constraint differs from place to place. Now, notice that one huge difference with Argentina, Venezuela, and let's say Brazil, just focusing there for the minute. Mexico is a kind of special case, right? Is that, that Argentina, first of all, has this peculiar history and inherited a sort of not only a history of instability, dollarization, and all that, but with Macri, you had a kind of policy that was bound to end up in crisis in a way that would leave the right unhappy and leave the left unhappy. And so, they sacrificed their finance minister to that cause. So Argentina, the political will of that country to take necessary steps, in part to deal with their legacy of debt, is problematic. And Venezuela, has a similar, needless to say, even more dramatic history. We could get into like Ecuador and so on. And, and we would see also that a lot of it is the historical overhang and the way in which that constrains the options today. Now, if we look at Brazil, interesting because when Lula comes in the first time, he's Pelosi, his finance minister. Do they close the markets as was thought? I mean, remember talking to Rogério Studart about that back at that time. No, they don't. They kept the markets open. The feeling was that the markets have to be managed, and frankly, Brazil's banks operated in such a way that they avoided falling into crisis or insolvency, as happened, for example, as institutions, as happened in Mexico. So the tequila crisis in Mexico in the mid '90s pretty much results in the sale or failure of all the major Mexican banks except for one. Brazil doesn't go through that. There were other methods that were used to avoid that, even as you went through the Real period and all of that, and even as you went through some of the consequences of like the Argentine crisis, the ruble crisis, and all the other crises that were always hitting Brazil in second or third wave, if not immediately. So in some sense, the nation, even under the workers' government, the PT, was proven to be robust. And actually, that was part of the semi-success, let's call it, of the Lula government up until the time of Dilma Rousseff. And of course, let's not get into Dilma Rousseff per se, but just to say by that time, the disorganization around the world, those shockwaves were really hitting Brazil. And President Dilma did not survive that. We then go through a kind of double transition period, and we then have the kind of on the U.S. the incoherence of Trump, on Brazil the incoherence of Bolsonaro, and but the one thing that was signaled by both Trump and Bolsonaro was market friendly, and so to that extent, but that wasn't a surprise because that the markets have been open, and again, the Brazilian financial institutions had largely, there was a couple of exceptions, of course, but they had largely taken steps to protect themselves. And so they were going forward. And basically, we had this situation in which when the Lula government comes in, there's once again an overreaction. Why? Well, that's because you have an overreacting global system. Keep in mind that you have bubble driven growth. And in bubble driven growth, if you read, for example, uh, uh, Brunemeyer, Marcus Brunemeyer's brilliant works over the years, he's always coming back to the idea of bubble driven growth, that basically in a world in which you can't make much of a return on anything because of the low interest rates and or low rates of real growth, you look for bubbles, and what you try to do is get in on the bubble before others, ride the bubble for a while, and then jump off before you end up taking the losses. Those games can be played anywhere, and they certainly are going to be played to a greater extent elsewhere in the world. Now, what happens with Brazil then is that, a few things. First, there is, of course, initially an overreaction to Lula's return, but that's accompanied by a Brazilian economy that's in a different position. As you mentioned, the commodity situation is different than before, and Brazil's positionality in the global economy is different. So you have this problem of, that we've survived that. Now, where do we go in future? Now, here's where it would be interesting to turn some attention to the so-called new developmentalism of Bresser Pereira, because devaluation. What is that going to do? Now, first of all, keep in mind, following Taylor and Krugman from way back in the day, 1978 paper pointing out the possibly the depressionary effect, well, the recessionary effects of devaluation. If you're in a situation where the intermediate goods you're importing are less price elastic than your exports, and if you're in a situation in which market structures are not kind to what you're selling. So keeping those factors in mind, you have a situation in which the devaluation and the return to competitiveness of the Brazilian economy is is basically unlikely to occur unless there's a substantial effort to rebuild Brazilian industry. That was done originally using technologies that are now out of date in an earlier era and in a time when S was able to operate independently and under the cover of a developmentalist state regime. Are we able to go back to that? Can we go back to that with a central bank that is simultaneously been signaling its commitment to an orthodox monetary policy? And of course, that's your contradiction in the Brazilian economy right now. The central bank's commitment to basically orthodox policy has somehow reassured foreign markets that, oh, Brazil gets it, and and they're ahead of the curve, so they're all right. At the same time, you don't have a chance to try the kind of Bresser Pereira wished industrial policies, although we would have to keep in mind to do that, you'd really have to pay attention to whether or not you could autonomously renew financing capacity, and you'd have to pick winners and pick targets, and you'd need like what would be the next embraer, and that's not clear right now. Now, turning second question, the the can we imagine that human beings will overcome the the limitations of neoliberal financialization, basically, and will they do it by recognizing that there's a common problem requiring a global solution? I think they're kind of two separate questions in there. Are we really still in a neoliberal era? I wonder that. I teach this module where I always wonder, what should we call this period now? Is it still anything goes, cross borders? It's fine. Yeah, it is kind of right for the financial sector, sort of. although they've been constrained more than in the previous years. So what do we make of that system? And basically, is it slowing down because trade flows are really worsening? You saw that brief illustration in my one slide, but actually, in the last few days, there's been worries that Europe's selling to China has really dropped off. China's apparently got a nice export surplus based on its continued success in exporting, but that's not shared elsewhere. So we're seeing somehow the uneven effects of the coming tightening of industrial policies, and Europe is very much in the bubble there. European automobile sales to China are dropping off as Chinese electric vehicle companies take over, and they're not buying Mercedes Benzes like they were. And furthermore, the engineering in those new technologies is not with a European monopoly, as have some of the other more older technologies. So I think you're seeing the momentum of a truly open trading system, both for financial and for goods trading, coming to a halt. Now, notice that if it was just pure neoliberalism, you'd have everybody would have to, sort of look at themselves and say, okay, the global financial system just crashed. Let's hold hands and get rid of it and go somewhere else. That didn't happen in 2009. Instead, there was a return to austerity. What about now? What about with climate burning? I actually think it's possible that we may be at that point of people across borders. Now, that across borders work, of course, President Lula would be an important figure in that because he's one of the few figures globally that has any kind of credibility. So it's interesting to see if President Lula can sustain and overcome the challenges domestically that we've touched on. He could be a thought leader, although that would require a developing country leader to step forward in between the bullies of the world system, the US, China, Russia, and to make everybody sit down and have peace. I suspect it's going to have to be after the Ukrainian crisis comes to what is likely to be a very unhappy stalemate and truce. How long can that go on? Who's financing that war and whose benefit is it? Et cetera. Those kinds of questions have to be addressed. So I think that while the emergency of climate, so ever present, so clear, day after day, week after week, is driving us to that common understanding, I think at the same time, we have to unlock this puzzle. And I have a slim hope that a leader from outside the dominant powers could step in between. But they've got as was once said, does the Pope have an army? Well, does Lula have an army? Not like the Russian army, not like the US, not like the Europeans, not even like Ukraine. And so I fear that it's going to be some years yet. And somehow this puzzle and problem of Vladimir Putin's romance for a Russia that exists in his imagination as the greatness that was lost, forgetting the fact that he paid off all of his friends when they robbed the Russian state of its assets. And on the other side, the offsetting myth of the Western powers in the north there, that they can use NATO to secure their security, and they should bring more and more nations into NATO right up against the border of this paranoid country. That's got to stop. And until it does, I don't think we're going to be able to sit down at a table in which President Lula should be the one bringing the parties together. Sorry, I'm not more optimistic.
Any other questions or comments?
Although, let me say one thing. So I'm working really hard. I'm not there because I'm working really hard on a regional project, inclusive growth, sustainability. it's in the frame. It's been given to us. We'll get some money, right? And the 12 universities and all that if we win. Will it solve the problems? No. 3-year project, just under £5 million among 12 universities across 5 million people. No, we're not going to solve problems. But I think that at the micro level, we have to point the way forward to possible solutions, possible new platforms, new ways of communicating, new ways of decision making, even at the micro and meso levels, that could point the way to how people could cooperate if we were really serious about more circular economies. This project is unfolding in a country that has a silly and useless macro policy that's cut itself off from its main trading partners in Europe, and that has no clue about where it's going with its economic strategy. But we have to do our part, whatever part that is. And the part we have to do right now is to try to make some sense of how to take the very good spirit of public workers and communities at those micro and meso levels and to give them support as they try to figure out how their children and their communities can survive better. So, in some sense, I know that my task is hopeless in the sense of the broader picture I've just portrayed. But I think that, it doesn't mean that it's not important to play our part. Let's do what we can, everybody. Sooner or later, when the moment comes, let's think of what Minsky used to say. Takes a model to beat a model, right? Takes a number to beat a number, takes a plan to beat a plan. Are we going to have plans? And they're going to need to be not just macro plans, they're going to need to be micro, meso, and regional and macro, as well as international plans. Each level is going to need work, and it'll be your generation and my students and others that I hope will be there to take this thing forward. Thanks for your attention. Is there any other questions, or are we at a good point?
Great point.
Great one, Gary.
All right, then.
Thank you very much, Gary.
My pleasure.